Just come in.
Okay. Right.
Oh, can I say something? Because I'm switched on. Chris O'Brien, thank you for your email, Chris, if you can hear. I've responded.
This isn't a social call, Jackie.
Well, it was about the last talk, so.
Oh, right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending our virtual Wolverhampton History Week. Just before we start, a few housekeeping things. Please make sure you're muted throughout the event so we don't have any background noise. And we are also going to be recording this event, so if you don't want to appear on camera, turn your cameras off. If you're happy to appear on camera, that's fine. If you want to, throughout the event, if you want to ask any questions, if you use the chat facility at the bottom, where you just type in and press return, there isn't like a button to send it. And then we'll filter those to Jackie at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Jackie Harrison. I'm sure she doesn't need much introduction, but Jackie Harrison, who's going to take us on a kind of whistle-stop tour of the history of Dudley Street, all the way from Saxon times to, I think, the 19th century, which is quite a lot of history.
It is.
Over to Jackie.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. If you bear with me a moment. Share. Make it big. That's it. Okay. Right. I should warn you in advance that this is going to run to about an hour and 10 minutes. So if anybody's got to be off, I'm just warning you in advance. And welcome to Dudley Street, part of a town that developed from ancient heathland through small monastic settlement into prosperous medieval wall town with fighting people and arguing people. In fact, probably the most disputatious load of people you've ever come across. And when I first did this talk, somebody said to me, Dudley Street, really? Why? Well, there is a reason, so I'm going to tell you. I began to wonder some years ago if there was anything you could tell about the early development of Wolverhampton outside of the two Anglo-Saxon charters, whereby Lady Wolfram gave land to the monastery of St Mary to support the monastery. And while I was looking around, reading, searching, I came across a lady called Dr. Delahook, who is a historical geographer. So she looks at old documents, maps, anything really that looks at the lay of the land, how communities might have got together, how they would have communicated with each other, and all the associated historical bits that go sort of with that. And while I was reading through some of Della's works, I came across two things that I didn't actually know before. I knew, for instance, that Wolverhampton was built on sandstone. What I didn't realise was it was part of a larger feature called the Birmingham Plateau. And if you look at sort of a sketch of the plateau, it seems to have lots of stubby little fingers. And this is our own dearly beloved Wolverhampton, stubby little finger in contour form. So the red numbers are metres above sea level. And for anybody who hasn't looked at contours in a very long time, the blue lines associated with the numbers mark out equal heights above sea level for anywhere on that line. So you can see from that that Wolverhampton's a bit up, down, up, down, up, down. And you've only got to walk around Wolverhampton to realise how up, down it is. To put some context on this, that's where St Peter's Church is. So you can see we are still really only talking about the old township of Wolverhampton. We're nicely situated. North will get you to Stafford. West will get you to Bridge North, east will take you off to Willenhall, and slightly skewed to the south, you get to Dudley. Of course, we really want, I thought I really need an area that's flattish, because if somewhere's going to develop, perhaps as a residential area, you're going to choose to build on flat land rather than up and down a hill. So somewhere in there, I thought. And this is when I came across the second thing that I didn't know at the time anyway, and that is that there was an ancient ridgeway that went through where Wolverhampton now stands. And as you can see, St Peter's Church and its forerunner, therefore, St Mary's Monastery, was, as we would say around here, right in the middle of the Oss Road. It's in a very inconvenient place, or it's in a very convenient place. It depends on what your point of view is. It certainly would have obstructed a straight through walk if you were sort of going from Dudley to Stafford. There is some evidence, apparently, that a bit later on there was like a side path, a side road that actually took you around the area of the monastery and the developing town. And for a place that's often accused of having its ring road in the centre of town, I just adore the fact that we once might have had an Anglo-Saxon bypass. And this little flashing blue bit here is exactly along the line of Dudley Street. So that's why I chose Dudley Street, because it was the earliest feature I could identify, even though it wasn't a building, that had possibly been used by people way back before the Romans reached us. Then history does that wonderful thing it does to you sometimes. Just when you're getting excited, you get nothing else related to the area of research for several hundred years. I should say at this point, I'm only going up to around 1900 or just after. And that's because when we got into the early 20th century, the information just exploded and my head was threatening to explode along with it. We can have a look at the early growth of the town, though, of which Dudley Street would have formed part, because it would still have been a main road on a flat area, so open to development, particularly residential and farming development. And what we can say is that we know in 994, Lady Wolverhampton grants lands to St Mary's Monastery in Hampton to support the community. In fact, if you go back to 985, that was when King Ethelred granted her his manor, if that's the right word, of Wolverhampton and Trescott for the same purpose, really, for the good of her soul, I think. So you've got a small community there, and as long as you've got some monks somewhere around, depending on their individual skills, you've got to have a chap who makes pots and a chap who makes pans and all that sort of thing to support the community. Moving on, sort of about 90 years, we've got Doomsday. And Doomsday tells us that Wolverhampton, or Hampton, as it was just called at that point, there were 6 villages, 30 smallholders and 14 slaves. I don't know whether slaves were allowed to have families. Possibly they were, possibly they weren't. But if you just take the 36 other people, they are sort of heads of house, if you like, so they'll all be men, many of whom would have had wives and children. So you could have had a small community, say, around 50 to 100 people. Move on a bit further, about 90 years now. The monastery has gone. And what we have now is a collegiate church, the Collegiate Church of St Peter. And the Dean of the College of Wolverhampton at that time was Peter of Blois. And he was writing a letter to the Pope complaining about the behaviour of his prebends, so the individual people that looked after different aspects of the church's lands and people. And he wrote that the townsmen treat his prebends with contempt. So there must have been townsmen worth taking notice of, and obviously a town as well. Otherwise there wouldn't have been much point writing to the Pope about it. Then you move into the middle of the 1200s and Henry III is giving us a market charter. Probably more really this is bringing business and money, of course, into the town rather than just for local people to potter around with cabbages, but it all assisted growth. And then in 1392, Richard II granted a licence to Clement Lewson and William Waterfall, who were described as priests, to found a hospital dedicated to the Virgin Mary for 6 people. There's some debate over where this might have been situated because it's not really known, but all we do know is by the time you got to Henry VIII's Reformation, it's gone. So wherever it was, it didn't last a huge amount of time. And then, of course, during the latter half of the 15th and into the 16th centuries, the wool trade came to town big time. It had been around before, but this is the period when it really began to take off and many fortunes were made in Wolverhampton as well as in many other places. And just to clarify what that means is lots of these sacks of wool and not thousands of these all looking for a shave and a haircut. Wool trade operators were loosely split into two sorts. So you've got your staplers, the merchant of staple of Calais is usually how it's described. They bought and sold the raw wool. Drapers who bought it and manufactured woolen cloth, then passed it on to tailors, and so on it went down the chain. Now, as a bit of a sort of a rest now from the dates, which you're probably getting a bit fed up of, we'll jump forward a few hundred years and we'll have a look at some of these disputatious neighbours. I could go on and on forever about this because there are so many records relating to arguments that go on. But I'm just going to restrict myself to 3 examples. So we've got a case of a trespass, false imprisonment between a member of a woolstaper family and a draper. There's a dispute over landlording and property ownership, and mobs just gone completely mad. So this case of trespass. One family with members who were significant as staplers were the Lewsons. Now, it's spelt Lewson, and these days it's pronounced Lewson. All the past documents sort of suggest that it was actually pronounced Lewson, as with Clement Lewson, who co-founded the hospital. And a name prominent amongst the drapers was Howlett. And the documents relating to this particular case are all the National Archives. They haven't actually got a date, they're just somewhere within the reign of Henry VIII, but reference to these people in other areas suggested the 1530s. And in Dudley Street at the time, there lived John Howlett, a draper, looking very swish in his nice swingy pink coat and his long hose, and his neighbour, Thomas Lewson, gentleman, looking extremely Henry VIII-like. And Mr. Howlett was building a new house right next door to his neighbour, Mr. Lewson. And while the building was going up and the framework was still in construction, they noticed that Mr. Lewson's house had got a slipped roof spar. Now, in the case papers, Mr. Howlett said that he tried in such a friendly manner to talk to Mr. Lewson about this. So basically it was, "Hello, Mr. Lewson, would you mind fixing your roof spar, please?" But the result was no. And off he went. It's not actually clear whether he said no or whether he listened and just did nothing. So, okay, what's Mr. Howlett going to do? Well, he and his carpenter came up with a wonderful idea. They thought the best way to solve the issue was actually just to chop the spar off. Now, it was only about 4 to 6 inches of spar, but when you imagine that roof spars are holding up a very heavy roof, that's not a good idea, no matter how much you dislike your neighbour. And so Mr. Lewson decided he would sue Mr. Howlett and his carpenter and a couple of other workmen who just happened to be there at the time with trespass. Off they went to King's Bench Court at Westminster, where it was said that Mr. Howlett did not deny the trespass. And the court asked the Sheriff of Staffordshire to look into the damages and the costs, which he did by bringing a jury together who came, or at least some of them came, to look at the situation. And the outcome was that Mr. Lewson was awarded £2, 4 and 4p. That's about £2.21.5 for anybody who doesn't do pre-decimalisation currency. Now, Mr. Howlett was very annoyed at this because he believed he should only actually be paying the value of the piece of wood that was cut off, which was 2p in his estimation, which in new currency is not worth even 1p. So he decided he would swear out a bill of complaint at Star Chamber. And this is how his bill of complaint goes. He stresses how very close to his own ground Mr. Lewson's house is, so that overhanging spar was a real problem for him completing his own house, which of course timber framed at the time. He accuses the jurors in the previous trespass case of being confederates of Mr. Lewson and light persons and without conscience who would do anything he said for small rewards, and making a corrupt assessment of the damage done. So this was his £2, 4 and 4p versus his 2p. And he complains that since then, Mr. Lewson brought another action of trespass against him for driving his cattle over ground that Lewson claimed rights to, but actually it was a common way for everybody. Again, I'm afraid he was found to be in the wrong, and he was ordered to pay £5 and 2p, which he did pay, but only when the sheriff gave him a bit of a nudge. And last, but by no means least, he happened to be at court for another matter one day, and he saw Mr. Lewson there. And Lewson caused the Sheriff of Middlesex, who was like the Sheriff of the court, to arrest him and put him in the Marshalsea prison for non-payment of the £5 and twopence. And he had to pay it again to get out. Further, Mr. Lewson doeth daily vex and inquire your subject and his neighbours, and somebody should do something about it. Oh, problems. Mr. Lewson's answer to this bill of complaint starts in the same way. He starts by explaining the layout of his message, his capital message, which basically means it's usually occupied by the owner and it's several messages or properties all lumped together. And associated with it are 2 gardens, 1 orchard and other grounds, all this trolling up and down Dudley Street, very nice. And he says it is an old house, but it's sure, i.e. it's not falling down in his view anyway. And it's been there for over 100 years, so it was there long before there was any argument between himself and his neighbour, Mr. Howlett. Problem is there, you know, that it doesn't matter how long it's been there, if your roof spars slipped, your roof spars slipped. But the thing I like about this for history is it pushes the history of that particular house back into the 1430s at least. And before the trespass, Mr. Lewson explains, well, Mr. Howlett had at the south side of my premises a little cottage. You can see where the problems might arise. And he built his new house where his cottage used to be. And it is so high that he did not only unlawfully stop ye light, 16th century planning regs, I love it, but he also willfully, unlawfully and maliciously did break the stars and tiled roof. And the new house is so close to mine that his rainwater falls into my gutters. Well, I have that problem, but I just live in a modern semi. And the jury for the trespass was picked by the sheriff, not me, and most of them were unknown to me, although I did note that 4 of them lived nearby. When I say I did note. The damage and costs awarded weren't really sufficient. And regarding the trespass of Mr. Howlett's cattle, well, I have 3 acres of arable land of my own, and I lease 3 acres of meadow from Mr. William Underhill, and no part of these 6 acres are common land or right of way. And I sued Mr. Howlett because his cattle were allowed to eat my wheat, stray on my meadow grass, and I was awarded £5 and twopence. Well, here's the problem. The Sheriff of Staffordshire didn't return the writ. In other words, he didn't tell Mr. Lewson that Mr. Howlett had actually paid the bet. So when he saw Mr. Howlett at Westminster, he was told by the attorney of the Common Place to sue him again. Sounds a bit like Citizens Advice Bureau. And then, unknown to me, the Sheriff arrested him, Howlett. And when I spoke to the Sheriff about it, he said that he would not be teached his office. Go away, Lewson, don't tell me how to do my job. So I paid all the costs of Mr. Howlett's arrest by the advice of the Justices of the Common Place. Fair enough. To which Mr. Howlett agreed. I think Mr. Howlett just forgot to mention that. And I was reimbursed by the Sheriff of Staffordshire, and I do not disquiet any of the King's subjects, although other documents around the same time suggest that he actually might have done. Right, let's move on a bit. The outcome was, I beg your pardon, we don't know, because there are no Star Chamber orders or decrees that still exist any longer. They've all gone walkies or gone to the fire or gone somewhere. So I hope one day that I might stumble across a letter between 2 people of the time where somebody's having a bit of a gossip and says, have you heard about Mr. Howlett and Mr. Lewson and the outcome of their case? I live in hope, small though it might be. So let's move on now into the 1700s and look at this dispute over landlording and property ownership. In the early 1720s, there was a case going through Chancery about 2 properties, 2 houses in Dudley Street, and Mr. and Mrs. Entworth, William and Catherine, were the plaintiffs. Susanna Stokes, a widow, her children and a brother-in-law were the defendants. And commissioners were appointed by the court to come to Wolverhampton to interview people regarding the dispute and try and get at the truth of who owned the properties, who paid for what the situation was. There are 35 witness statements, and 80% of them are in favour of the defendants. And one outcome that I like for local history in this case, and in many other cases with court cases, is you get these witness statements, you get the names, you get the ages, you get the trades of so many people within your area of interest before there are any surviving street directories, well, for Wolverhampton anyway, and certainly before we had census. And the story that emerges out of these documents goes like this. 1707 in December, Mr. and Mrs. Entworth mortgaged 2 properties in Dudley Street to William Stokes for £200. 12 months later, the repayment date for the debt fell due and it hadn't been repaid. So in theory, the ownership of those properties went to William Stokes. But there was something called an equitable redemption. So as long as Mr. Entworth kept paying whatever the interest rate was that was agreed and didn't default on that, he still had the opportunity to pay off the principal sum at some time in the future and so regain his properties. And 2 years after, again in the winter time, William Stokes died. And in his will, he left the outstanding mortgage debt as an inheritance for his 3 daughters. Obviously, somebody had actually got to get the money, first of all. So after his death, there was a short period of confusion when Mrs. Stokes became the landlady and Mrs. Entworth was marching around not liking it very much. Mr. Entworth didn't reside in Wolverhampton. He had done once, but he hadn't been seen in the town for quite a long time. So Mrs. Entworth was actually his agent, if you like, carrying out whatever it was he wanted doing. And it has to be another 10 years really before the dispute eventually gets into Chancery. To summarise the witness statements, one of the buildings was built up, or possibly half built up, it's difficult to tell, with bricks, and it was in good repair. The other was old, half timbered and very ruinous. The timber in the roof was broken. Sounds a bit familiar. There had to be a number of repairs to the woodwork and the glazing. Ironwork had to be furnished a number of times for chimneys, for doors, for fireplaces. And both buildings by now had been converted to 3 dwellings each, so 6 tenements in all. And quite a few tradesmen testified to the jobs they'd done, who'd hired them, who they'd paid, and in the most main, it is actually Mrs. Stokes, and the materials they'd used for their various jobs. For example, 2,800 bricks cost £1 3 and 9 pence. That's about £1 19 and a half pence. And given that in old money, there were 240 pennies in a pound, you know, 10 bricks for a penny? A load of lime, how big is a load? I don't know, but that's comparatively more, 11 and 8 pence, possibly because it has to be processed carefully before it can be used. Another processed product, locks, one for the chamber over the stable, which might mean the stable block had been turned into one of the tenements, and one for the main door, 5 shillings, 25 pence. And 200 tiles, presumably for the roof, cost 3 shillings. So again, those things made of clay, bricks and tiles seem to be comparatively cheap when compared with the others. So for instance, 2 parcels of nails, how big's a parcel? Your guess is as good as mine, cost 7 and 2pence. So that's about 36 pence. Several of the tenants had left their tenancies within the past 10 years because of Mrs. Entworth, who was stomping around telling people that she actually wanted her properties back. And she was known to have said that, some people said that she had threatened the tenants with lawsuits. So just to cite one of the witnesses, 25-year-old Mr. John Meredith of Glover. He said that Mrs. Entworth is a very troublesome woman with the tenants and had often threatened this deponent to fling his goods into the street. She told him she'd indict him in the Crown Office just for taking his hay through an entry to his stable, and she frequently used threats like that to himself and to other tenants. He said, I was very well pleased when I was got from the house. not being able to live quietly, being afraid and uneasy with the threats. Poor little chap. And I would sooner live in a wilderness than live under the complainant's wife. I wonder what Mr. Complainant thought. Anyway, this case was eventually settled out of court when Mr. John Pountney, local butcher and landowner, bought those two properties for £380, £280 of which went to the Stokeses to satisfy the mortgage debt and the court costs, and the Ainsworths got the remaining 100. And now we'll have a quick look at these mobs gone mad, which basically top and tail the 18th century. The 18th century is the first place you can talk about with a lot of information because there was so much stuff being recorded. Background: 1689 saw the implementation of the Toleration Act, which legalised public worship for non-Church of England Protestant bodies. And one of the chapels that was built subsequent on the Act was round the back of Dudley Street in John Street. So here's a quick snippet out of Isaac Taylor's 1750 map of Wolverhampton. And you can see this red line here on the right, which is Dudley Street. And coming off it, the blue line is John Street, which tracks across basically where Manda Square is now. And in the spring and summer of 1715, there were quite a lot of riots across England protesting against the new Whig government of George I. And Protestant dissenters were often allied to Whigs because they had similar political beliefs, so any group opposing them were automatically given the opposition label of Tory, and this included, after the Irish mobs, and this included the rioters of 1715 who just seemed to like attacking dissenting chapels. So 29th of June 1715, the Tory mob came to Wolverhampton and attacked the chapel in John Street and destroyed it, and wrecked a nearby house. Very glad I wasn't living there then. The chapel was rebuilt later, and one of the families who had belonged to the future dissenting community was the Manda family. In 1791, Benjamin Manda lived, worked and worshipped in John Street when another mob situation arose. And the background to this was political as well, because it was a tough time of tension between those who supported the principles of the French Revolution, usually known as the Jacobins, and loyalists who said, I'm happy with the way it is, leave it like it is. Some rioters came over from Birmingham to Wolverhampton to continue what they considered their work. There were a high number of apprentices within this group. Apprentices seemed to like joining mobs for some reason. Benjamin Manda was one of their targets. But fortunately for him, the mob decided to go to the chapel first, which I don't think they did much damage to, which gave time for somebody to nip down the road to Benjamin and warn him there was a mob on their way. At which he posted his front door, sword in hand, and put a rather beefy servant with a poker at the other entrance. And allegedly they were so fierce, and combining that with, there was an 8 o'clock curfew bell for the apprentices, that seems to have won the day. And by the following day, there were several troops of cavalry in the town, which prevented reassembly. Right, we've had a little break then from all the datey things, but I'm afraid we've got to go back to them to consider how people living in Wolverhampton actually developed, and particularly what we can tease out about Dudley Street. So we've seen, for instance, that Doomsday gave us about 36 villagers plus 14 slaves, which might have given us 50 to 100 actual people living in the town at the time. We saw the Dean's letter to the Pope referring to townsmen, implying the town was worth protecting in some way. We saw the market charter of 1258, and therefore the town had to be able to resource visitors no matter what else happened. The first thing I've found at the time I was putting this talk together that referred to Dudley Street came from 1351. I've actually since seen a couple of references in the catalogue to something in the 1320s, which I suspect might be Dudley Street, but because of COVID restrictions, I can't get over and look at them. So Marjorie, a widow, a daughter of Reginald Woodward. I'm not quite sure why she isn't a widow of somebody rather than a daughter of her father. But anyway, she was ceding her dower rights in a message to Edith, daughter of Reginald Francis. And the property is described like this. It extends lengthwise along the King's Highway, leading from the church of Wolverhampton towards Dudley, and it lay between the tenement of Marjorie, daughter of Thomas Hatlow, and went as far as that other tenement. It was. Now, you might think to yourself, well, hang on, how do you know this is Dudley Street and not Dudley Road, as we now call it? Well, that's highly unlikely, because once you up to the top of Snow Hill, you to the old town fields, not all of them, but some of them, and you just didn't build messuages, houses, buildings, barns in the town fields at that time. And you've got 3 messuages in a row there, so you certainly wouldn't have those in the town fields. This is that document. It's written in Latin, which I had to do some serious research on, and it's written also in abbreviated Latin, which was the way they wrote in those days. But I thought, how on earth am I going to sort this out when I don't actually know what the word says? How am I going to recognise the abbreviation of the word? Well, fortunately for me, Nottingham University put some very helpful documentation, advice and examples online, which, combined with the fact that these sort of documents are very formulaic, actually made the task quite easy. Moving on to 1489, there's another grant of land with a tenement being made, and this talks about a property situated lengthwise between the said street called Dudley Street and a lane called Fell Lane, leading to the highway which leads to Willenhall. Well, the road to Willenhall even today is out to the east of the town, roughly. And so I think that would probably put that settlement somewhere on the Marks and Spencer side of the street. 1532, we get a big sale. This is a messuage together with houses, plural, a farm, courts, gardens, etc. And this cost was 100 marks, so £66 13 and 4pence, £66 66 pence in today's money. And it is described as situated lengthwise from Dudley Street into a little lane, and that's all you get. So apart from the fact that it mentions Dudley Street, there's no hope of trying to place it anywhere. A bit later on, you do get a sale of a messuage that's got a curtilage and a garden, and it describes this property as situated lengthwise, so this is down the street, from the garden of Walter Lewson down towards Dudley Street on the west, and then in breadth between the capital messuage of Walter Lewson, so his garden and his messuage must have been in an L shape somehow, on the south, and the messuage of Thomas Lewson Esquire, called the Sign of the Swan, on the north. More Lewsons. This guy was living in a Lewson sandwich. Here's back to the map of 1750, and this is the Swan. And irrespective of what materials it was built on over time, it was there really for many hundreds of years. So that property probably sat in there somewhere. And then we get these things called terriers. Most of you might know what it is. If you don't, it's like a list of somebody's property saying, here's the name of the person, here's a description of the property, and this is how much they have to pay, and this is whether they paid or not. So they can be quite helpful. And this is 1609, okay. So we're able to pull out some information about Dudley Street from this. I'm going to plonk this map up again, but with the north, south, east, wests already on. Before numbers and on properties, the way they would, if you like, place it in the landscape when they were describing it in documents, was to say who or what was north, south, east or west of them. So we have a Mr. Richard Pratt, a tenement with a garden in Dudley Street with Hollow Lane on the south. Well, here's Dudley Street coming down here with a red wiggly line, and at the bottom of it, this is Hollow Lane coming up to meet it. Hollow Lane eventually became Belcroft Street, then Bell Street, and it did used to come up to Dudley Street within living memory sort of thing, but you lost the link really when the multi-storey car park was built for the Wolverhampton Centre. It would have come out roughly opposite where Old Hall Street is. So anyway, that puts Mr. Bratt about there, not knowing how big his plot was. It could have been bigger, smaller. And the only other thing it says about it is that on the north of him, there was some land of Mr. Mosley. So that puts Mr. Pratt and Mr. Mosley's land there. And then you get a little run of neighbours, north to south, and they are Henry Edge, who had a tenement and a garden, John Kay, or possibly Key, a messuage with a barn and a garden, and John Whittick, who had a messuage, a shop and a garden. I don't know whether that's a shop for selling things or a workshop. In 1609 is probably a workshop. But given how they were situated north-south of each other, they probably fit in there, or they could possibly have been a bit further up. But we're beginning to get the sight of the sorts of people and properties that were in Dudley Street at the very beginning of the 17th century. And then we around 6048, there's a big sale of a messuage called the Sign of the Star, so it means a pub. And associated with this was an adjoining messuage. There were stables, there were barns, there were 2 gardens, and the wholesale was £225. That's quite a lot. And it just says on the north was property of Sir Richard Lewson. These Lewsons get everywhere. Moving about 90 years further on, there's a marriage settlement, which refers to a dwelling house commonly called Little Farm, being settled on the family of the bride. And then a couple of years later, there's some title deeds describing a messuage formerly called Little Hall, plus an adjoining messuage. Those two might actually be the same place, actually. And then the last one in this little lot, in 1733, a chap from Dudley called James Puxley started to accumulate a block of buildings, which included 4 which fronted to the west side of Dudley Street. So to be on the west side of the street, you have to be on the boot side. And eventually, when numbers were applied to them, they became numbers 28 to 31. And the block of buildings is the 2 rows of buildings going back into the land behind. Some might have been dwellings, some might have been workshops. And locally, it was known for 170 years almost as Cox's Court. This is a different map that you find in the archives. This is part of the, I call it the water map, but it's a health of towns map really, when they were looking at how you might develop better sewage and water provision. They're a bit dark, but they are huge. There's many sections to them and they're very detailed, so they're well worth a look at actually. And there's Dudley Street going down there. Just coming up to it here is Bilston Street. Here's numbers 28 to 31. And the land that ran behind is in this block here. It's a court. There were lots of courts everywhere in the town. Dudley Street was no exception. And if you have a look at the 1797 rates books for Wolverhampton, for Dudley Street alone, it shows 78 properties in 12 courts. That's more individual properties than there actually were along the street itself. So you can see how by now the town has developed by filling up the land behind, which might once have been gardens, orchards, pleasure gardens, whatever. And that all comes to an end in 1902 because the Central Arcade opened on the site of Cox's Court, which many of us will remember, built by a Birmingham developer. And apart from the shops, it also had a working men's club, it had a rifle range, it had a temperance dining room. And in the early days, bands played music from a gallery. And there was some talk in the 1950s of the possibility of bringing the music back, but then it was decided it might attract the wrong type of person. I'm thinking Teddy Boys myself, so it didn't actually happen. Of course, it was retained as part of the new Maunda Centre when that opened in 1969, but then 5 years later there was a fire which burnt it down, so the remains had to be demolished and then rebuilt in new formats. So here's a rather fuzzy photograph, I know, of the aftermath of the fire. You're looking through to the arched area in the back. She's looking through into John Street, yes. And you can see the little sort of, they're like 2 stories, brick-built cubicles, basically. But anybody who remembers going down there remembers the interesting shop windows and the nice wooden doors and everything. Right, So you have to have water to put a fire out. You have to have water just to live from the very earliest times, and for hygiene. So water everywhere, or was there? Well, in 1686, Robert Plot published his Natural History of Staffordshire, and in it he said that in respect of Wolverhampton and its residents, they have but 4 weak springs to supply so large a town. He sounded very surprised, and so was I. Actually, that quote, there's 8 lines of quote, are carved into the Chinese benches in Princess Street. Have a look next time you're passing. So I looked for something else from around the same time that might have financial accounts in, and the constable's accounts do seem to have what I would call public spending information in, so that's where I looked next. And what came out of that was there were actually a dozen water pumps around the town, so you weren't reliant just on wells. And 2 of these pumps, one was in Dudley Street, and over that 26-year period of the constable's accounts, it had to be maintained 5 times, which sounds very economical to me. And one of them had to have a new cerecloth. I'm not sure what a cerecloth is. I haven't been able to find out. The Hollow Lane or Hollow Way pump, you know where that was, round the corner, however, had to be maintained 36 times, including many, many repairs and replacements of the leather bucket. And on one glorious occasion, it had to have its swig mended, and I don't know what a swig is either. Research has not helped me. Jumping into the middle of the 19th century, we had the Public Health Act, which enabled authorities to develop better sewage, better water supply and all the rest of it. And one of the things you could do was you could have an inspector come down from the Board of Health to have a look and give you some advice. So Wolverhampton invited one, and Inspector Rawlinson came to town, and he reported back to the Board of Health with various comments and recommendations. Now, on the upside, our new red sandstone was of a structure that had many pockets of water flowing through it. Hooray! And new improved drainage systems would be helped by the town's natural elevated site. We saw that at the beginning with the contours, how it dipped away or grew up, depending which way you were looking at it, and the good natural gradients in all directions. On the downside, however, any existing sewers and drains, and there were some, were very close to the surface, and they just poured into what had once been the nearest ditch. Well, we know what happens with ditches over time, especially if liquid gets into them. They tend to rise up till they're just a dip rather than a ditch. So anything lying in there would be stagnant and smelly and horrible. Inspector Rawlinson said there's 4,000 houses in the town, 26,000 people. That's a bit of a jump up from the 50 to 100 that we imagined in 1086. But these people had no convenient way to free themselves from their refuse, but are necessitated to keep it in their houses or the immediate neighbourhood. Now, we all know that, but sometimes when you see something written as a cold, hard fact, it really brings it home to you. He goes on to say that there are large open ditches in the centre of town and the suburbs, by which he didn't mean going out to Wensfield, Penn, Tetnall. He meant just sort of spilling over the edge of the town. And in summer, they gave off 200,000 cubic feet of miasma. How delightful. There was no accurate information about where or how deep any existing sewers were. So when they needed to be opened because sewage was seeping up above ground level, they were obliged to be fished for into the Ministry of Holes, I suppose. Their junctions very rarely met at right angles. So, for example, the Street sewer, so we did have one, and the Snow Hill sewers met each other opposite, but then they had to drop their sewage a depth of 3 feet into the Bell Street sewer. Now remember, Bell Street was formerly Hollow Way, Hollow Lane. Many towns and villages had a Hollow Way, Hollow Lane, and it's usually somewhere worn down over time by the passage of feet or soft underlying earth. So we can see what some of the problems were there. It did mention that another sewer discharged itself from George Street into another one in St John's Square, and the contents percolate up through the graves. How delightful. There was a waterworks in Tetnall. They couldn't supply water all day, every day, but they did their best, and the company were quite disappointed with the slow uptake of the service. Rawlinson thought it was probably a fact of people preferring to stick with pumps, which at least gave them water all day long, every day, and they hadn't actually got to spend money. But as a mark of how good their service was, the company boasted that the pressure they could make available to fire water carts through the plug opposite the Swan Inn. I tried to find out where that was, but it's not marked on any maps, and there don't appear to be any records of it anywhere, was sufficient to throw a 3/4 water jet completely over William Parks's house in Dudley Street, which was about 50 feet from the plug. I haven't been able to find any evidence of William Parks around about that same time, but he must have been there. I do remember attending a talk once, a lady who wrote a book about Charles Dickens' visits to Wolverhampton, where he stayed at the, I can't remember whether it was the Angel or the Swan, but one of the places he liked to visit was Mr. Clark's bookshop, so that might be that Mr. Clark. Right, so we've done a few more dates and things now, and we've looked at water. We're going to have a quick pick on one building, if you like, and see what we can find out about it. So we all know this one, Marks and Spencer, which ranges over numbers 18 to 24. But nowadays it ranges over numbers 18 to 24. There's a bundle of documentation, and this sketch is attached to something that's just dated as 1937 up to the 1950s. It's not actually clearly marked on this document, but what we can see from it is there's Dudley Street at the top. And if I just highlight this bit here and put the details over on the left so you can read them more easily, it says, this is Marks and Spencer's, formerly Newman's, and it covers 22 to 24. Here's another one. Marks and Spencer's, formerly Whitfield's, covers number 20. And sandwiched in the middle and still holding on to its independence, Wilson's at number 21. I think that might have been a ladies' wear shop. And then over on the right here, again, Marks and Spencer, and it's described as the main store, numbers 18 and 19, and it was their main store. It's where they first came to Wolverhampton. They've got a little bit here at the back, which also says it's part of the main store. And then just that little bit left at the bottom there, number 16, is Premier Wallpapers. And in this very nice 1935 photograph, you can see most of that. So if we combine that with some data in a trade directory, this shop here is Southern's, Southern Brothers. It's numbers 14 to 15, and it gentlemen's and boys wear.
Oh my goodness.
Go to it there, which you might just be able to make out. It actually says Freeman, Hardy and Willis. I'm sure many of us have been there in the past, and that's at number 16. So boots and shoes. Right next door is this little entrance to Castle Yard. Next door to that, very prominent, we can see it says George Mason at number 17. And just disappearing off the edge of the photograph, Marks and Spencer at numbers 18 to 19. So this is one of those happy times when documentations from transactions and deeds, a photograph and data captured in a trade directory actually come together to support each other. It doesn't happen very often. But prior to M&S arriving in Wolverhampton around 1929, one of their original properties had for many years been a public house. So this is number 19 and or 19A. It seems to have been combined and then split off at some point. From at least 1833, 1920s, it was home to the Red Cow. Here's one of those very nice Alan Eaton paintings based on a photograph of Francis Frith, or from Francis Frith's collection anyway. And here we can see the Red Cow on the right with its nice lamp. And you can probably just see here to the left of that oval, Freeman's boots. So he's still in the same place, but obviously he hadn't met Mr. Hardy and Mr. Willis at this point. And back in 1837, the ownership of 19, 19A and 20 was changing hands. And the transaction described numbers 19 and 19A, later to be part of M&S, as a public house called the Red Cow, with a brew house, with a shop adjoining used as a butcher shop, a slaughterhouse and premises at the back, 2 messuages at the back of the butcher's shop, a yard, pigsties, presumably to furnish the slaughterhouse, stables and various other appurtenances. And here's the sketch that actually accompanies that description. So we can see Dudley Street on the right. You've got the red cow there showing up. You've got the butcher's shop next door. And then right at the back here, one of those pumps, look. Moving further back into the premises, we've got the slaughterhouse, bang next door to 2 residential houses. And moving further back up against the Market Street wall, you've got various piggeries. And then you've got a small privy. It's not very big, is it, for all of those people? Must have been a bit steep down Market Street at that point. You can see here, just above, this is Mr. Beaumont at number 20. Now, Mr. Beaumont is there really only by virtue of his wife, Anne, who was the only sister of Thomas Phillips of Wolverhampton, a surgeon, who had died intestate. And was granted administration of his estate in May 1823. And digging back a bit further into documents associated with this bundle, we find that a Mr. John Molyneux was involved in purchasing all 3 properties, 19, 19A, 20, from 2 brothers who owned them, Richard Phillips of Shrewsbury and Thomas Phillips of Wolverhampton. 10 years later on, John Molyneux is making a written declaration to the effect that the purchase and the purchase money rightfully belonged to Thomas Phillips, the deceased. Mr. Molyneux was declaring that he had allowed the use of his name with the intention that he would just hold the properties in trust for Thomas, and that Thomas had actually been in possession of part of the hereditaments, by which I think he means living there, and in receipt of the rents and profits of the rest ever since. Well, this all sounds a bit dodgy, so why the deception? Well, it's not dodgy. The declaration was being made to a group of commissioners in a commission of lunacy against poor old Thomas Phillips. There was a jury also acting under the commission that stated that Thomas no longer had lucid intervals, and he'd been like this for about 1.5 years. And he couldn't look after himself or his properties or his goods. They couldn't find how he came to be in this state, except by the visitation of God, so meaning natural causes. Whether his work as a surgeon with various lotions, potions and other bits and pieces had anything to do with it, I don't know. And don't know whether Thomas remained living in Wolverhampton until he died soon afterwards, but certainly he's buried in Shrewsbury. And here is a page out of St. Chad's burial register. And we can see we've got Thomas Phillips, Esquire of Wolverhampton, being buried on November the 1st, aged 52 years. So, next time you go into Marks and Spencer's, you just think of this mix of associated sort of aromas and sound. You've got a pub, you've got a brew house, you've got a slaughterhouse, you've got dwellings, you've got pigsties, you've got an outside privy apparently serving the whole block. It's not just the same, is it, as their owner ladies' fashions? It just doesn't gel. Right, we're going to go behind some more, have a bit of light relief. We've got 2 small sections now, and then you can all go home. Well, you all are at home, aren't you? We're going to have a pub crawl. And I'm going back to the what I call the water maps, because that nice sort of triangular set of roads in the middle just describes exactly where it is I want to go. So we're in the 1830s. And means we actually know where the Red Cow is, we might as well start there. But we could have gone a couple of doors down and started a pack horse in. No, we'll stick with the Red Cow. We'll have a jar or whatever passed for a jar or a pint or a half pint in those days. We're feeling a bit refreshed. We come out, we trot up the road. Oh, look, the King's Head. I doubt if Henry VIII was the king. He was probably one of the Georges, but I've used him because basically he's very recognisable. So into the King's Head we go, have a bit more to drink. I think it's about time we had a bit of fresh air, but coming out the side door, we just sort of stumble across and find the Hen and Chickens, not to be confused with the Hen and Chickens that was later on down the Dudley Road. We are a bit squiffy by now. We definitely need to get some fresh air. So out we come and we think we'll have a little bit of walk, or we'll turn this corner. We now on the corner of Bell Street, previously Hollow Lane. So we are where in 1609 Richard Bratt was living, with some land of Mr. Mosley just above him. We have a slow trot down the lane and then wiggle through the houses into John Street or John's Lane, whatever it's been called at this point, and we spot the Seven Stars. We pop into the Seven Stars. It's a bit full, that's the problem. We come out, we don't mind, we've only got to go across the road and we find the Anchor. Have a quick one in the Anchor, small place, very crowded. We come out of the Anchor, oh well, we'll just pop up here to the Pine and see what we can get. It's a bit crowded in there as well. Now, by now, the pennies in the pocket, there's not many left. They're jingling around and we're thinking, room for one more drink, I think, within the pocket money we've been allowed. So we'll just pop up the road here until we get to the Plough. Coming out of the Plough, no money. It's getting late. It's very dark. We trot up the road and turn the corner, and we realise we've almost come full circle. We're actually very pleased with ourselves because we have managed to avoid the Peacock, the Coach and Horses, the Wolfpack, yet another King's Head, the Bell, the Fox and Hounds, and so it goes on. One place we didn't mention was just on this corner here, and that's because on this map, although you probably can't see it very clearly, that is just a spirit store. But what we know about that building, so it's on the corner of John Street, which is now Wolfpack Alley. There are some documents relating to it. And in 1697, there was a document which said that it had been known for a long time by the name or sign of the Welsh Harp. Early in the 1700s, apparently, it changed its name to the Fleece Inn. And much later on, it was renamed the Golden Fleece after another Golden Fleece in another part of the town closed down. And later still, into the early 1900s, it was known as the Bodega. And in the closing years of the 1700s, it gained a well-known, at that time, landlady. And this was her, Mary Hitchcock's, licensee and owner of the Fleece. We know about this because she is in the family history of Norman Tildersley, local historian, now sadly passed away. But he's left his papers at the archives, city archives, for people to see. She was born in Wensfield in 1765, Mary Hope. She went to work in service as a seamstress at Molyneux House, so where the archives are. And in 1794, she married the first of three husbands. This is a bit late, really. She'd have been 29 by now. Now, almost immediately, they bought the Fleece, which had been for a few years just a beer house. But Thomas had got experience of a butler to a prominent Willenhall family, and that experience enabled them to apply for and get a full licence for wine, spirits and beers. Regarding the beers, these were days of brewed on the premises ale, so your success depended on the quality of your brew, and they seem to have been successful, so I assume the brew must have been good. Now, Thomas didn't last very long, 6 years, and he died in 1800, and in 1801, Mary married her second husband, George Buxton. I'm afraid George didn't last much longer. He died in February 1808, and in September of the same year, Mary married her third husband, William Hitchcock, who was a few years younger than she was. Norman tells us that before each marriage, she safeguarded her own estate with a marriage settlement. Clever girl. She actually retired from business around 1816, so she'd have been about 51 by then, so it's quite an early retirement. But she kept the inn and rented it to tenants. I suppose this was her pension. And she died in 1859 at the grand old age of 94. And although she passed away in Wolverhampton where she was living, she's actually buried at Wood Street Cemetery in Willenhall. And 90 years later, in November 1949, one of her great-great-nephews passed away, aged 93. This was Norman's father. And Norman said that his father could just about remember her, Mary, in his very early childhood. And so their joint lives covered like 184 years. Imagine if you could get brains and plug them together, the history you could drag out of that combination. And although he didn't know it at the time, Norman was going to reach 92 himself before he quietly slipped away. And this is just a slice out of the tombstone. It confirms Mary's age, her death date, and we can see also that Mr. Hitchcock survived, and he died a few years later, aged 91. So living in a pub in those days didn't necessarily shorten your life, according to that. This is the bodega. This is the building concerned. I dare say it had various makeovers throughout the years. And this is a nice snowy day in early 1900s Wolverhampton. But a few odds and sods, and then we're coming towards the end. So, in 1891, there was a sale in Dudley Street of pub-related trade fixtures, so there were lots and lots of glasses, as you might imagine. But for your delight, you could have had 5 second-hand iron spittoons. I do hope they washed them out properly. And you could also have had an iron bung burner. Now, this is an iron bung burner. What I don't know about it is whether all of that is iron and you heated the bottom bit up in fire and pushed it into the hole in the barrel and sealed the hole the bung was going to go into, or whether the burner is actually just the handle bit and the bit on the end is actually a wooden bung which you then put into a fire again to seal it so you got no leakage. Answers on a postcard, please. In July 1815, the Leicester Chronicle carried this little bit of information. There were some workmen taking down an old house in Wolverhampton at the corner of Clark's Lane, that's lower Queen Street, and Dudley Street, and they found a considerable quantity of silver coins from the reigns of Elizabeth, James I, and Charles I, which are in a high state of preservation. I tried to find out if those had remained in the town in some fashion, but apparently they haven't. I don't know what the rules were in those days, whether it was finders keepers or whoever technically owned the property got it. The date sounds right because this was around the time that the bottom end of Queen Street was being developed. But I do wonder, you know, who died and forgot to tell the relatives where the loot was. And then this nice little story from May 1834, which is actually in the Naval and Military Gazette. And it's talking about a public house in Dudley Street called the Crown and Cushion, one we didn't mention earlier on. There was a large fire because there was a club meeting later on. There were some people singing in the street opposite with a crowd collecting around them. And at this particular time, 2 miners, apparently in revenge for having been denied another jug of ale, threw a 25-pound barrel of gunpowder upon the fire. The landlady and everybody else in the house managed to escape, but 2 individuals actually didn't. One of whom was paralysed with fear at the position he was in, and he was just rooted to the spot. And the other was our hero, John Oakley, a young man of very approachable character, who seized a towel, which just happened to be hanging nearby, and wrapped it round his hands for defence, dove into the flames and lifted the terrible combustible from the middle of the fire. The towel was very extensively burned and may be seen at the house. Things that attracted you in those days. Lots of people who knew about gunpowder said that if it hadn't have been taken out of the fire, the pub would actually have been destroyed and possibly the house next door materially damaged, and goodness knows what might have happened to the people outside in the street. And I do hope that young Mr. John Oakley didn't have to buy another pint for the rest of his life. But is there any evidence, or has there been in recent times any evidence of any of the old stuff in Wolverhampton? Because we've had so much development, most things have gone, but there are a few snippets. So for instance, there's this turn of the century photograph where you can see a double gabled black and white timber building, obviously with a low roof, so it's dating from quite a long time ago, a low saggy roof I might mention. And you can picture where that is because the building to the left is Buxton and Bonnet. You can just about see the Onnet of Bonnet on the plaque between the windows. And the building on the right, again, you just about see the end of the sign, it's 8 Samuels. So we're looking from the bottom end of Queen Street across the road, basically. And if you move a bit further down the street, but not very far, towards Queen Square, you get a similar sort of building, another double um, roof that has its origins in an old building. And a photograph that was in the Express and Star in the 50s, early 60s, actually shows some work being carried out on this same building, and you can see that they've uncovered the original timber and brick infill on this building. And then, of course, we've got this place, which actually stood at the bottom of Snow Hill, but was right where it joins Dudley Street, the Peacock Inn, or hotel, as it says there. When the Swan Inn up near Queen Square closed down, the emblem outside was brought down to the Peacock, and you can just about see it sitting just below the roof line between the two gables at the front, and then it became known as the Swan and Peacock. That got pulled down within living memory. Here it is being pulled down. And why was it pulled down? Well, it was pulled down so they could build C&A. Who remembers C&A? And obviously then you got the Manda Centre development that came around on top of that later. Right, so this is Dudley Street as we know it today. The foreground, we're in a place called Wolverhampton Square, which is a nice nod to the lady who supported the forerunner of the church at the top of the street. Here we are, we can just about see the Church of St. Peter's up there. It's not a very long street, but when I walk down there now, having done the research, I sort of see the ghosts of that medieval ridgeway, allowing people to track their way from one place to another. I see the ghost of a noble matron Wolfen here in Charles Wheeler's depiction, who actually gave lands to the monastery for the good of her soul, I think, rather than anything else. Here's the priest, Clement Lewson, who founded a hospital which didn't last as long as one would hope. I also remember that lady who ceded away her dower rights to quite a large property in Dudley Street. I also see that nice gentleman with a swishy coat and his neighbour, who's looking much more Henry VIII-like, and I wonder if they're still arguing somewhere. And that troublesome woman and her husband, who caused so much trouble over two properties within the street. And then, of course, there is possibly Thomas Phillips and his brother Richard, before his bad days, strolling like 19th century gentlemen down Dudley Street. We've mentioned a lot about the Lewsons, or I've mentioned a lot about the Lewsons in this. Is there any evidence left in the actual town itself of their existence? Well, the only two bits that there are really are in St. Peter's Church. So you've got this tomb, which is of John and Joyce Lewson, who both died in the 1570s. So one assumes the tomb actually comes from that time. And then another one probably worth noting, in the chapel a little bit further down, is this nice bronze statue of Admiral Vice Admiral Sir Richard Lewson. All of those can be gone and seen. It's well worth a visit to St. Peter's if you've never gone in and had a little walk around. Sir Admiral Richard Lewson, if you consider him and his father and a cousin he had in Kent, there's some very interesting stories to be teased out there, but that, as they say, is a tale for another time. That's the end. Thank you for sticking with me. And I know Heidi will have a question and answer session, but if anybody actually wants to drop me an email, particularly if you can tell me what is a cerecloth, a swage, or what you do with the bung burner, or even if you can just fill in more local knowledge, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. Back to you, Heidi.
Hang on. Thank you very much, Jackie. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. And a lot of areas that we obviously know quite well ourselves.
Yeah.
And I've made a note of some stuff for myself. Just on point ages ago, right towards the beginning, you talked about the Latin document with abbreviations.
Yeah.
If anybody does struggle with Latin documents, or even later on they switched to English but still used quite complicated abbreviations.
Yeah, yeah.
come and talk to me if I'm about, or come and find me, or leave a message for me, because I have got training in medieval Latin abbreviations and all that sort of stuff. So, and like you say, a lot of it is kind of formulaic. So once you kind of understand which bits should be where in the deeds or whatever, you can kind of work out what it says.
Yeah.
But I mean, if anybody's interested, I can probably do a session at some point about handwriting and abbreviations, because I have got a lot of stuff that I can.
That sounds excellent to me.
I don't know whether I'm committing myself to something there, but I do have that sort of knowledge. So great, thank you. We haven't actually got any questions. We've got 3 different people who are saying it's a really interesting talk and such detailed research. Great talk, thanks, Jackie.
You're very welcome. Thanks for staying with me, as I said. Yes.
Has anybody actually questions?
It's
nice to have praise as well, isn't it?
Yes, it's a lot to take in. I mean, people tend to start nowadays and work backwards, and that's when it can be off-putting, because you start looking at trade directories, at censuses, which give you a lot of information, but it's information overload. You can't process it, so you sort of think, look, I've had it, I'll give up, which is why I started way back when.
Which is more difficult to then
it's more difficult, but your head can manage it better. Yeah.
Yes, we've got lots of people saying what a fantastic talk, and somebody's going to share the video to his sister in Norfolk, etc. So you're spreading what's far and wide. Does anybody have any questions for Jackie?
I should think probably not. Which is why I left my email up there.
Oh, it looks like you're off the hook in terms of questions.
Wow, hooray! Now go to Sainsbury's. How do you like it?
Unless people email you specifically.
Yeah, okay.
They're too shy to ask questions.
Folks, anyway.
That's great then. Thank you very much, Jackie. And thank you.
That's okay. No problem.
Okay. All right.
Hope to see everybody soon.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.